Welcome to Study Section 13, Social Reforms, Women and Reform, Women's Role in the mid-1800s. In the early 19th century, women faced limited options. Prevailing customs demanded that women restrict their activities after marriage to the home and family. Housework and childcare were considered the only proper activities for married women. Later, that tradition became known as the cult of domesticity. By 1850, roughly 1 in 5 white women had worked for wages a few years before they were married. About 1 in 10 single white women worked outside the home, earning about half the pay men received to do the same job. Women could neither vote nor sit on juries in the early 1800s, even if they were taxpayers. Typically, when a woman married, her property and any money she earned became her husband's. In many instances, married women lacked guardianship right over their children. Mobilization of women for reform. Despite such limits, women actively participated in all the important reform movements of the 19th century. Many middle-class white women were inspired by the optimistic message of the Second Great Awakening. Women were often shut out of meetings by disapproving men and responded by expanding their effort to seek equal rights for themselves. Women abolitionists like Sarah Hand Angelina Grink, daughter of a South Carolina slaveholder, spoke eloquently for abolition. In 1836, Angelina Grink published an appeal to Christian women of the South, in which she called upon women to overthrow this horrible system of oppression and cruelty. Women abolitionists also raised money, distributed literature, and collected signatures for petitions to Congress. Some men supported women's efforts. William Lord Garrison, for example, joined the determined women who had been denied participation in the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. Garrison said, "After battling so many long years for the liberties of African slaves, I can take no part in a convention that strikes down the most sacred right of all women." Other men, however, denounced the female abolitionists. The Massachusetts clergy criticized the Greek sister for assuming the place and tone of man as public reformer. Opposition only served to make women reformers more determined. The abolitionist cause became a powerful spur to other reform causes, as well as to the women's rights movement. Working for temperance. The temperance movement, the effort to prohibit the drinking of alcohol, was another offshoot of the influence of churches and women's rights movement. Speaking at a temperance meeting in 1852, Mary C. Vaughan attested to the evils of alcohol. In the early 19th century, alcohol flowed freely in America. Liquor helped wash down the salted meats and fish that composed the dominant diet, and until the development of anesthetic in the 1840s, doctors dosed their patients with whiskey or brandy before operating. Many Americans, however, recognized drunkenness as a serious problem. Lyman Beecher, a prominent Connecticut minister, had begun lecturing against all use of alcohol in 1825. A year later, the American Temperance Society was founded. By 1833, some 6,000 local temperance societies dotted the country. Education for women. Until the 1820s, American girls had few educational avenues open to them beyond elementary school. To as Sarah Grink, who ran a school for women with her sister Angelina, complained in the letters on the equality of the sexes and the condition of women. 1838, a woman who knew chemistry enough to keep the pot boiling and geography enough to know the location of different rooms in her house was considered learned enough. In 1821, Emma Willard opened one of the nation's first academically rigorous schools for girls in Troy, New York. The Troy Female Seminary became the model for a new type of women's school. Despite much mockery that they would be educating cows next, Williams School prospered. In 1837, Mary Lyon overcame its resistance to fund another important institution of higher learning for women, Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, later Mount Holyoke College, in South Hadley, Massachusetts. In the same year, Ohio's Oberlin College admitted 4 women on its degree program, thus becoming the nation's first fully co-educational college. African American women faced greater obstacles to getting an education. In 1831, white Quaker Prudence Crandall opened a school for girls in Canterbury, Connecticut. 2 years later, she admitted an African American girl, but the townspeople protested so vigorously against desegregated education that Crandall decided to admit only African American students. This aroused even more opposition, and in 1834, Crandall was forced to close the school and leave town. Only after the Civil War would the severely limited educational opportunities for African American women finally, though slowly, begin to expand. Women and health reform. In the mid-19th century, educated women also began to work for health reforms. Elizabeth Blackwell, who in 1849 became the first woman to graduate from medical college, later opened the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. In the 1850s, Lyman Beecher's daughter, Catherine, undertook a national survey of women's health. To her dismay, Beecher found 3 sick women for every healthy one. It was no wonder women rarely bathed or exercised, and the version of the day included corsets so restrictive that breathing sometimes was difficult. Amelia Bloomer, publisher of a temperance newspaper, rebelled. Bloomer often wore a costume of loose-fitting pants, tied at the ankle and covered by a short skirt. Readers besieged her with requests for the sewing pattern. Most women who sold the Bloomers, however, considered it a daring venture, as many men were outraged by women wearing pants. Emergence of women's rights movements. The various reform movements of mid-19th century fed the growth of the women's movement by providing women with increased opportunities to act outside the home. Senecal Falls Convention. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided to hold a women's rights convention. They announced what will become known as the Senecal Falls Convention for the New York town in which it was held. Stanton and Mott composed an agenda and a detailed statement of grievances. Stanton carefully modeled this Declaration of Sentiment on the Declaration of Independence. The second paragraph began with a revision of very familiar word. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Some of the revolutions that were also proposed at the convention spoke to the circumstances with which women reformers had struggled. Nearly 300 women and men gathered at the Wesleyan Methodist Church for the convention. The participants approved all parts of the declaration unanimously, including several resolutions to encourage women to participate in all public issues on an equal basis with men, except one. The one exemption, which still passed by a narrow majority, was the resolution calling for women to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, the right to vote. The vote remained a controversial aim. Some thought suffrage was an extreme solution to a non-existent problem, as Lucy Stone's sister wrote in 1846, "I can't vote, but what care I for that I would not if I could." Sojourner Truth. Women reformers made significant contributions to improving social conditions in the mid-19th century. Yet conditions for slaves worsened. Isabella Bunfree, a slave for the first 30 years of her life, took the name Sojourner Truth when she decided to sojourn, that is travel, throughout the country preaching and later arguing for abolition. At a women's rights convention in 1851, the tall, muscular black woman was hitched at in disapproval because Truth supported abolition. Some participants feared her speaking would make their own cause less popular, but Truth won applause with her speech that urged men to grant women their rights. As Truth showed, hard work was a central fact of life for most women. In the mid-19th century, this continued to be the case as women entered the emerging industrial workplace. Once there, they continued the calls for women's rights and other social reforms. Americans' story. Religious reform. When Charles Grandison Finney preached, his listener shrieked, moaned, and fainted. The most famous preacher of the era, Finney inspired emotional religious faith using a speaking style that was as much high drama as prayer or sermon. Converted at the age of 29, Finney traveled by horseback to deliver his message. Finney seated the most likely converts in his audiences on a special anxious bench where he could fasten his eyes upon them. He lectured on the depth of the conversion experience. The convert's duty was to spread the word about personal salvation to others. This religious activism or evangelism was part of the overall era of reform that started in the 1830s. Reforms of the period included women's rights, school reform, and abolition, the movement to outlaw slavery. All of these movements emerged as responses to rapid changes in American society, such as early industrial growth, increasing migration and immigration, and new means of communication. The Second Great Awakening. Much of the impulse toward reform was rooted in the revivals of the broad religious movement that swept the United States after 1790, known as the Second Great Awakening. Finney and his contemporaries were participants in the Second Great Awakening. These preachers rejected the 18th century Calvinistic belief that God predetermined one's salvation or damnation, whether a person went to heaven or hell. Instead, they emphasized individual responsibility for seeking salvation, and they insisted that people could improve themselves and society. Religious ideas current in the early 19th century promoted individualism and responsibility. Similar to the emphasis of Jacksonian democracy on the power of the common citizen, Christian churches split over these ideas as various denominations competed to proclaim the message of a democratic God, one who extends the possibility of salvation to all people. The forum for their messages were large gatherings where some preachers could draw audiences of 20,000 or more at outdoor camps. Revivalism. Such a gathering was called a revival, an emotional meeting designed to awaken religious faith through impassioned preaching and prayer. A revival might last 4 or 5 days. During the day, the participants studied the Bible and examined their souls. In the evening, they had emotional preaching, but could make them cry out, burst into tears, or tremble with fear. Revivalism swept across the United States in the early 19th century. Some of the most intense revivals took place in a part of western New York known as the Burned Over District because of the religious fires that frequently burned there. Charles Finney fanned these flames, conducting some of his most successful revivals in Rochester, New York. The Rochester revivals earned Finney the reputation of the father of modern revivalism. Revivalism had a strong impact on the public. According to one estimate, in 1800, just 1 in 15 Americans belonged to a church, but by 1850, 1 in 6 was a member. The African American Church. The Second Great Awakening also brought Christianity on a large scale to enslaved African Americans. There was a strong democratic impulse in the new churches and a belief that all people, black or white, belonged to the same God. Thus, the camp meetings and the new Baptist or Methodist churches were open to both blacks and whites. Slaves in the rural South, though they were segregated in pods of their own, worshipped in the same churches, heard the same sermons, and sang the same hymns as did the slave owners. Enslaved African Americans, however, interpreted the Christian message as a promise of freedom for their people. In the East, many free African Americans worshipped in separate black churches like Richard Allen's Bethel African Church in Philadelphia, which by 1816 would become the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Allen inspired his congregation to strengthen its faith as well as to fight against slavery. Membership in the African Methodist Episcopal Church grew rapidly. It became a political, cultural, and social center for African Americans, providing schools and other services that whites denied them. Eventually, the African American Church developed a political voice and organized the first Black National Convention, held in Philadelphia in September 1830. Richard Allen convened the meeting, in which participants agreed to explore the possible settlement of free African Americans and fugitive slaves in Canada. To Allen's convention was the first of what would become an annual convention of free blacks in the North. The African American Church gave its members a deep inner faith, a strong sense of community, and the spiritual support to oppose slavery. Transcendentalism and reforms. Many reformed-minded individuals sought an alternative to traditional religion but found revivalism too public a forum for religious expression. By the mid-1800s, some Americans were taking new pride in their emerging culture. Raphael Waldo Emerson, a New England writer, nurtured this pride. Emerson led a group practicing transcendentalism, a philosophical and literary movement that emphasized living a simple life and celebrated the truths found in nature and in personal emotion and imagination. Exalting the dignity of the individual, the transcendentalists spawned a literary movement that stressed American ideas of optimism, freedom, and self-reliance. Emerson's friend Henry David Thoreau put the idea of self-reliance into practice. Abandoning community life, he built himself a cabin on the shore of Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, where he lived alone for 2 years. In Walden, 1854, Thoreau advised readers to follow their inner voices because Thoreau believed in the importance of individual conscience. He urged people not to obey laws they considered unjust. Instead of protesting with violence, they should peacefully refuse to obey those laws. This form of protest is called civil disobedience. For example, Thoreau did not want to support the U.S. government, which allowed slavery, and fought the war with Mexico. Instead of paying taxes that helped finance the war, Thoreau went to jail. Unitarianism. Rather than appealing to the emotions, Unitarianism emphasized reason and appeals to conscience as the path of perfection. In New England, Unitarianism quickly attracted a wealthy and educated following. In place of dramatic conversion produced by the revivers, Unitarians believed conversion was a gradual process. William Ellery Channing, a prominent Unitarian leader, asserted that the purpose of Christianity was the perfection of human nature, the elevation of men into nobler being. Unitarians agree with revivalists that individual and social reform were both possible and important. Formation of Americans' ideal communities. Some of the optimism of religious and social reform also inspired the establishment of utopian communities, experimental groups who tried to create a utopia or perfect place. These communities varied in their philosophies and living arrangements, but shared common goals such as self-sufficiency. One of the best known utopian communities was established in New Harmony, Indiana. Another was Brook Farm, located near Boston. In 1841, transcendentalist George Ripley established Brook Farm to prepare a society of liberal, intelligent, and cultivated persons whose relations with each other will permit a more wholesome and simple life than can be led amidst the pressure of our competitive institutions. A fire destroyed the main building at Brook Farm in 1847, and the community immediately disbanded. Most utopias lasted no more than a few years. The failure of the utopian communities did not lessen the zeal of the religious reformers. Many became active in humanitarian reform movements such as the abolition of slavery and improved conditions for women. Shaker communities. Religious belief spurred other ideal communities. The Shakers, who followed the teaching of Anne Lee, set up their first communities in New York, New England, and on the frontier. Shakers shared their goods with each other, believed that men and women are equal, and refused to fight for any reason. When a person became a shaker, he or she vowed not to marry or have children. Shakers depended on converts and adopting children to keep their communities going. In the 1840s, the Shakers had 6,000 members, their highest number. In 1999, only about 7 Shakers remained in the entire United States. Schools and prisons reform. In the mid-19th century, thousands of Americans holding a variety of philosophical positions had joined together to fight the various social ills that troubled the young nation. Some social reformers focused their attention on schools and other institutions, reforming asylums and prisons. In 1831, French writer Alexis de Tocqueville had visited the United States to study its penitentiary system, observing prisoners who were physically punished or isolated for extended periods. De Tocqueville concluded that while society in the United States gives the example of the most extended liberty, the prisons of the same country offer the spectacle of the most complete despotism, that is, rigid and severe control. Reformers quickly took up the cause. Dorothy Dix was compelled by personal experience to join the movement for social reform. On visiting a Massachusetts house of correction, Dix was horrified to discover that jails often housed mentally ill people. In 1843, she sent a report of her findings to the Massachusetts legislature, who in turn passed a law aimed at improving conditions. Between 1845 and 1852, Dix persuaded 9 southern states to set up public hospitals for the mentally ill. Prison reformers and Dorothy Dix, in her efforts on behalf of the mentally ill, emphasized the idea of rehabilitation, treatment that might reform the sick or imprisoned person to a useful position in society. There was, as revivalists suggested, hope for everyone, improving education. Before the mid-1800s, no uniform educational policy existed in the United States. School conditions varied across regions. Massachusetts and Vermont were the only states before the Civil War to pass a compulsory school attendance law. Classrooms in the early schools were not divided by grade, so younger and older pupils were thrown together. Few children continued in school beyond the age of 10. In the 1830s, Americans increasingly began to demand tax-supported public schools. For example, in 1834, Pennsylvania established a tax-supported public school system. Although the system was optional, a storm of opposition erupted from well-to-do taxpayers. They saw no reason to support schools that their children, who were mostly enrolled in private school, would not attend. Opposition also came from some German immigrants who feared that their children would forget the German language and culture. Within 3 years, however, about 42% of the elementary school age children in Pennsylvania were attending public schools. One remarkable leader in the public school reform movement was Horace Mann of Massachusetts. After a childhood spent partly at work and partly in poor schools, Mann declared, "If we do not prepare children to become good citizens, If we do not enrich their minds with knowledge, then our republic must go down to destruction as others have gone before it. In 1837, he became the first secretary of Massachusetts Board of Education. In 12 years of service, man established teacher training programs and instituted curriculum reforms. He also doubled the money that the state spent on schools. Other states soon followed Massachusetts and Pennsylvania's good example. By the 1850s, every state had provided some form of publicly funded elementary schools. In states in the far west and in southern states, however, it took years before public schools were firmly established. This is the end of study session 13. Thank you for listening.